Hello.
Hello.
How are you?
I am doing well. How are you?
I'm good. I just got engaged.
So, Bishat Tova, tell me all about it.
Thank you. This past weekend, I proposed to my partner Elon. Um, and it was wonderful. I invited like all his friends and family to be there, and it was just like a super special weekend, and we're both super happy.
That's wonderful. Wait, does Elon have a last name?
Elevets.
Oh, okay. I know his parents.
I know you do, yes. Um,
Okay,
I think
cool.
yeah, I've Jewish geography has been discussed. Um, yeah. And yeah, we're super happy and it's been
Yeah.
wonderful.
Okay,
And
so when are you planning?
around like a year and a half from now, we don't have an exact like date yet.
That's great.
Yeah. So we're super happy.
Lovely. Mazal tov.
Thank you.
Oh, all right, we're gonna give it one more minute because people are still popping in. Okay. This is part 8 of our series on the 8th chapter of Bava. We're going to be tonight at the bottom of 85b and the top of 86a. And we are still sort of in the discussion of Shevet. And in particular, last time we were wondering, the Mishnah had said that if when you're calculating how much you pay to replace a person's wages while they're laid up, which is Shevet, you calculate that assuming that the person's earning the wages of a cucumber watchman, because the Mishnah said the guy has already paid him for his arm or his leg, or his arm and his leg. You can't really tell the difference between those two things in the Mishnah Hebrew. And we had already asked last week whether that means that everybody gets assessed as a cucumber watchman, even if they're able still, with whatever injury they have, to do something that would be more remunerative than that, or whether that was just an example. And we had said that that was the reason the Mishnah said he already paid him for his arm and his leg, is because we're talking about a case of somebody who lost an arm and a leg, and what they can do now is hobble around a cucumber field and scare away animals. But that means that other injuries would presumably result in other calculations. So we begin tonight with Rava gives us a list of different injuries that you could suffer, and excuse me, what job you might then be fit for as a result. Presumably these are examples also. It's not intended to be a comprehensive list. Yeah, Jerry, did you want to say something?
God bless you.
Thank you. 1 second. Okay, so Amar Rava. Chitat yado noten lo dmei yado. So if somebody cut off somebody else's arm, they pay them the price of their arm. V'shevet roinoto kilu shomer kishuin. And for shevet purposes, we calculate as if the person is a cucumber watchman. Shiberet raglo noten lo dmei raglo. If he broke the guy's leg, he pays him the value of his leg. Presumably, this is a break that is bad enough that it actually permanently damages the leg, possibly even permanently destroys the leg. The science of setting bones has improved dramatically over time. There was idea of setting bones and of splinting them. There were even primitive casts in pre-modern times. But your chances of recovering from a seriously broken leg are considerably better now than they were historically. So I think we're talking here about a more permanent and more damaging break than you or I would expect today with modern medical care. In any case, so you pay him the price of the leg, and v'shevet ro'inoto ki'ilu shomer hapetach. And for the purposes of shevet, we're going to see him as if he is a door watchman, because we're going to assume he needs a job at which he can sit down all the time, because we assume that at best he's going to walk with a limp and he may never walk again. Okay. Simat eno, noten lo dmei eno. If he blinded the person's eye, then he pays him the value of his eye. V'shevet ro'inoto ki'iluhu matchino b'reichaim. And for shevet, we see him as if he is a mill grinder. And I wonder if Rava doesn't actually mean that he blinded both of his eyes, because mill grinding sounds to me like something you would choose as the plausible employment of somebody who can't see at all, not somebody who just only has one eye. So I wonder whether the language isn't a little bit sloppy there. In any case, the idea here is that the way you grind with a mill is that somebody or something, if you're using an animal, has to push or pull the wooden piece that's attached to the top millstone around and around and around in a circle around the bottom millstone as it rolls, in order to roll the top millstone across the grain, which is sitting on the bottom millstone. I picture two extraordinarily heavy donuts, one rolling around the edge of the other, with a wooden hinge sort of deal in the middle that is then sticking out through the donut hole of the rolling donut. And you're pushing this stick because it's anchored to the center point of the hinge piece. You don't actually have to be able to see what you're doing. If somebody just takes you to this pole and says, here, hold this and walk, you could theoretically walk for hours. I mean, it's very hard work, but theoretically you could walk for hours without losing your way, because like there's nowhere to go. You're just holding this thing and walking and pushing on it. So you don't actually need to be able to see to do that. Okay. Chersho, if you deafened him, notain lo dmei kulo, then you have to give him the entire value of the person. The assumption here, and this is not an assumption that we would make today, is that somebody who is deaf is not employable at all. And therefore, somebody who's deaf has no value on the slave market. And therefore, whatever value he had on the slave market before you deafened him, that's what you owe him, because now his value is zero. As I said, we would not make these assumptions about deaf people. We wouldn't make these assumptions about blind people either, partly because our economy is much less based on physical labor. So jobs that mostly require thinking, I think, are more doable with various kinds of physical restrictions. And partly because we have much better technology. Right? In the invention of Braille, which I believe is early 19th century, and of sign language, which has always sort of existed but became much more structured, also I think in the 19th century, and of methods for teaching deaf people how to speak, also I believe that's 19th century. All of these things have made it much more possible to integrate people who are blind or deaf into the regular workforce. And of course, prosthetics have always made it possible to integrate at least some people who are missing limbs into the workforce. But I think we're making some broad generalities here.
Yeah, also, Al, this is a person who was deafened at a mature age. So presumably, if he was literate before, he can still read, and you could write him instructions on how to perform a job.
I think that we are about to see a person who has all of these things happen to them. And it may be that Rava also assumes that this is cumulative. So if we now have a person with no arms, no legs, no eyes, and no ability to hear. So he has no way of receiving instructions or of doing physical labor. He may, in fact, have a lot of trouble finding a job. Like I think that's if that's what we mean. If we mean each of these injuries separately, then yes, you're right, Harvey. There's no reason, for example, that you couldn't take the deaf person to the very same millstone that you took the blind person to, wrap his hands around the stick and motion to him that he's supposed to push on it. Like, I would think that he could still do that.
Yeah, but isn't there
But
a halachic problem in those days with deaf people being considered not real people?
so people who are deaf that's people who are deaf from birth, and they're not considered not real people. They're considered people who are not capable of halachic adulthood, in the sense that they can't make legal decisions, they can't sign documents, they can't be witnesses, they can own things, but they can't buy them or sell them. So you own things by inheriting them or by receiving them as gifts. So, but those are people who are deaf from birth, and those people, in fact, without sign language, it might have been very difficult to tell what's going on in their minds. So I don't, and somebody who is deaf but can read lips and talk, or can read text and talk, is treated halachically just like anybody else, except for mitzvot that require hearing. Right? We might not let that person blow shofar for people because they can't hear the shofar, so they're not doing the mitzvah. They might not be able to do it for someone else, or they might not let them read the Megillah. But otherwise, as far as I know, that person is treated exactly the same way as they would if they weren't deaf. That's why I think that in order for this particular deaf person to have to be paid his entire value, it kind of has to have been, he has to have some other disabilities here also in order for this to make sense. And in fact, the next thing that happens, this was Rava talking to begin with. We scroll back up here. Rava said all of this, and now Rava asked a question about his own statement. By Rava, Kitat yado v'lo amdu. So suppose we have somebody who all the way through, it's going to be the same assailant and the same victim. It seems like we've got a situation here where somebody really should have intervened, but that's not our point. Our point is afterwards, how much money are we charging people? But the truth is, if you see in your real life that somebody is chopping bits off of one of their neighbors, don't sit around waiting until they're done and then figure out how much money they owe. Stop them, please. Okay, sorry. End of public service announcement. Back to the Gemara. Okay, so Rava asks, suppose that somebody cuts off somebody's arm and but the case hasn't gone to court yet, and there hasn't been a formal appraisal of what he owes. Then Shiveret Raglo v'lo amduhu, then the same assailant breaks the leg of the same victim, but we don't have time for that to go to court either and get appraised. And before Simeat Eino v'lo amduhu, now the same assailant blinds the eyes of the same victim. And now v'levasof chirsho mahu. And now, and then in the end, he also deafens him. Okay, so he did all of these things to him, not all in, it wasn't like one attack where he, was trying to beat the guy to death and he only mostly succeeded. But I'm sorry, Jerry, it seems to be describing, but it seems like it's a series of different assaults that should have been tried in court separately, but either the court didn't get its act together in time, or the time scale was too compressed and they didn't get a chance. I'm really hoping this is a thought experiment and no actual people of any century are actually getting hurt here. Okay, in any case, in the end, he's done all of these injuries to the same person. So Rava says, Mahu. So what's supposed to be the law here? Mi amrinan kevan de lo amduhu bechad umdina sagile v'yahivle dmei kule b'hadei hadade. Do we say that since he wasn't appraised each time for each of the assaults, we're just going to appraise him once now, and we're going to say, well, he used to be a healthy person, and now he is a person with a broken leg, an amputated arm, a blinded eye, and deafened ears. And we're going to effectively treat it as if it was all one assault that resulted in all of those results. Or Odilma chada amdinan viavina lay. Or do we now, albeit in a delayed fashion, do each of the appraisals that we were supposed to have done to begin with and bill him for each assault separately? And you might wonder, what difference does it make? Aren't these supposed to be additive? So the Gemara or Rava has thought of that question already, and he answers it. Nafkamina debai lemetav le tsar uboshet l'kol chada v'chada. So it would make it, the only difference it makes is whether you have to pay for tsar, physical pain, and boshet, emotional pain, separately, because those presumably are greater if this happens in 4 separate occasions than if it happens all at once. Whereas the amount of time that you actually spent unable to go to work, that presumably is a documented actual physical fact. And your medical bills likewise are like an actual bill he's reimbursing you for. So either way, those we don't really need to, there's nothing to argue about there. And presumably the Nezek payments are additive, but the tsar and the boshet, it matters whether it happened all at once or whether it happened separately. Okay. And then I just got ahead of myself. So so granting that we're not going to need to give him separately nezek and ripui and shevet for the reason that I just said, because it's ripui and shevet are just a documented fact, and we'll just it just is, and nezek, the total is the total. Because in the end, you're going to pay him his entire value anyway. And so we are financially, not physically, but financially treating it as if the assailant had killed the victim. We're treating it as if the victim is being compensated for his entire existence having been destroyed. And you can't get a larger amount of money than that, really. Keeping in mind, unfortunately, that most of this chapter is a thought experiment in the sense that most people don't actually have enough money to reimburse the people that they beat up in bar fights or otherwise injure at this kind of level. And in real life, if someone with really deep pockets happens to injure you, these payments might be relevant, but most of the time in real life, no one is getting paid these kinds of amounts of money, just because it is possible to do vastly more damage than you have the money for. Okay, so Tsar Boshet Miha. However, the Tsar and the Boshet, maybe you should give those separately for each one. Because he experienced the Tsar and the Boshet separately. The fact that he ends up with his body basically destroyed at the end is not connected to the fact that he experienced several separate assaults. And here for Tsar and Boshet, we're not reimbursing him for the result, we're reimbursing him for the experience. And even if you say, Kevan de lo amduhu kayahiv le dme kule bahade hadade. Even if you say that since we didn't do the appraisals, he's going to get paid for the whole thing at the end. And so you say, no, I'm sorry, you don't get separate Tsar and Boshet. We're going to pay you Tsar and Boshet as if it had all been one assault. Even if we would say that, amduhu mahu. So in that case, what would we say if there had been an appraisal? But presumably no payment, because if there had been a payment made, we wouldn't, then that case would be over and we would not be talking about it anymore. But suppose there had been separate appraisals after each assault, just we hadn't succeeded in dragging the money out of the person. Would we say that because he was appraised, that he would have to pay one at a time? and you have to pay for each assault as if it was the only thing that happened. Odilma kevan de lo shalim yahiv le dmekule. Or maybe since he got appraised but didn't actually make a payment, we're going to just look at we're going to effectively replace the original court cases with a new court case, and treat it all as one case. And the result is teku. We don't have a solution. Teku doesn't represent a failure to understand what's going on. It represents a successful finding of the boundaries, right? You ask boundary pushing cases until you find the one where you can't tell which side of the boundary it's on. And then that's a teku because you can't tell where it belongs, but it's also a success because it means that you found the boundary. So tekus are for themselves frustrating for that specific case, but in general they're a successful defining of the parameters. Okay, now we go to Rabba, who I believe is the teacher of Rava. We're going up a generation. By the way, notice that their names are almost exactly the same. The convention is that the guy whose name is spelled with a hey, who's the teacher, is pronounced Rabba with a bet, and the guy whose name is spelled with an aleph, who's the student, is Rava. I have no idea whether that relates to how they personally pronounce their names. For all I know, they said their names exactly the same, but that's the convention now. Okay, so by Rabba, shevet ha hochtato b'damim mahu. So Rabba said, what about an injury that temporarily removes him from the ability to work and temporarily reduces his value? So the Gemara said, oh, well, what's that? Heichidami. Kegon shehikau al yado v'tzamta yado v'sofo lachzor. So suppose that he hit him on his arm or his hand, and his hand was weakened, not damaged permanently like a break or something, but I don't know, sprained or otherwise weakened, but it's going to heal. So in that case, what's the halacha? Kevan disofa lachzor lo yahiv lev lo midi. Maybe since the injury is not permanent, right? If you come back in a year, this person could have a completely healthy arm. So maybe you don't pay him a nezek payment at all. Maybe nezek payments are only for permanent injury. Or Odilma, or maybe hashda mihat aflate. Since right now his value on the slave market is reduced, you should have to pay something for that. And I think what we're assuming is that the reduction in his value on the slave market for a temporary injury, the marketplace should be taking into account the fact that it's not permanent, or that it's probably not permanent. So hopefully the marketplace takes into account what people think are the likely chances of recovery. And so on this side of the disputes, we would say, well, to the extent that it's temporary, okay, but that's taken into account already in the amount that his price went down. That's why his price didn't go down as much as it would have if it were permanent. But he did lose something, and that's reflected in the lowered price. Okay. There we are. Tashma. So Tashma, come in here, meaning we're going to quote something which we hope is going to help us with this question. This is a Breita, which I think we saw earlier in the chapter. I think we've seen this Breita once before. Somebody who strikes their father or their mother, but does not make a mark, right? There is in Parshat Mishpatim, it says Makeh aviv imo mot yumat. So that's a few psukim earlier than all of the other psukim in chapter 21 that we've been focused on until now in this chapter. But it's right nearby. So if you strike your parents in a way that does permanently injure them, there's a death penalty for that. But so that's why we're specifying here that it doesn't create a permanent injury, because if it did, we wouldn't be talking about money. But somebody who strikes their parents in a way that doesn't produce a permanent injury, and somebody who injures their friend on Yom Kippur, chayav bekulam, he is obligated in all 5 payments. And in both of these cases, the person who injured their parents but not making a mark on them, and the person who injured their friend on Yom Kippur, in both of those cases, you might have thought that there would not be a financial penalty because they came very close to getting a death penalty. Or I think in the case of Yom Kippur, I think it's karet actually, but which is effectively the same for our purposes. If you do a crime which should get a death penalty, even if you don't get killed because of a technicality, or because there are no witnesses, or because you didn't do it on purpose, or whatever, there are still no financial penalties for things that were supposed to have death penalties. But this is a case, what the Braita is telling us, these cases are far enough away from having a death penalty that it's a different case, and there is a financial penalty. Okay, what we're interested in here is, what does it mean to strike your parents without making a mark? Because that might be the same kind of temporary damage that Rabba was talking about. So, what is it? What's the case where you didn't make a mark? Isn't that a case where you hit him on his hand, but it's going to heal? Like that, wouldn't that make sense as a case for that? The case where you injured your parents but didn't leave a mark. And if that case, if it's the same case, Kitani Chayav Bekulan, the Braita says you owe all 5 payments. All 5 payments presumably includes all 5, including Nezek, and that would mean that we do give you the reduction in your slave market value, even if the damage is temporary. Okay, Amri, but now we have a problem because we have a commentary on this Braita that does not give us the same, that doesn't give us that case. So Amri hacha b'mayaskinan kegon shechersho velo asabo chabura. So they apparently said about this Braita that the case we're talking about with the parent is that you deafened them without making a mark. And that would be a reason why this is not talking about our case, because deafness is certainly, I think we're assuming here, permanent. The fact that it doesn't make a mark on the body, notwithstanding, it's certainly a permanent condition, which would not fit Rabba's description of a temporary condition, which temporarily lowers your value on the slave market, but doesn't permanently change your body. Right, so that would not be, that would just be an unrelated different case, if that's what this is talking about. V'hama Rabba, but that's not going to work. At least not going to work for Rabba, who's the only person we care about right now, because he's the one who asked the question. Choreshet aviv neharag lefi she'efshar l'charisha b'lo chabura tipta dedama nafal le'ba'odne. So Rabba said that if somebody deafens their father or their mother, it doesn't matter, but he says father, they're killed for that, even if you can't see a mark on the parent, because it's not possible to deafen without causing, he thinks, physical damage to the, I guess, the eardrum or the brain or something. And the fact that you didn't draw blood or make a scar in a place that I can see on the outside of the body doesn't mean that you didn't draw blood inside the ear. And the deafness is evidence that that must have happened. So that's good enough. And Rabba's ready to kill that guy. Okay, so from Rabba's perspective, and as I said, he's the one who asked the question, so he's the only one we care about here. The case of the hitting your parent and causing a temporary injury that results in you paying all 5 payments can't be about deafness, because he doesn't think you pay the 5 payments in the case of deafening your parent. He thinks we kill you. Therefore, he has to think it's something else. So for the moment, we could temporarily say, well, okay, so we're talking about Rabba's case where you hit his hand and his hand is injured but going to recover. But we have a new suggestion here. Maybe this is really what we're talking about. He shaved his father's head, presumably without his father's permission, because this whole thing only makes sense if it's a form of assault. And that would be gilcho mehadar hadar v'hainu ba'ayan. So if we're talking about shaving, then hair grows back. So temporarily the guy's bald, but it's going to come back. That seems to be our question. That seems to be our case as a temporary injury. So this same group of commentators on this Breita that always get in the way make a suggestion that would get in the way of that. So these guys suggest, now maybe you're right, he removed hair, but he removed hair using a depilatory that appears here to be permanent. The best of my understanding, the depilatories we use today are very temporary. And even to the best of my understanding, the depilatories that are described as being in cosmetic use in Masechet Brachot are also temporary. So I assume this is not like something that you're supposed to be using on skin. It's like something caustic that wasn't meant to be, like, we're talking about like permanent damage to the guy's skin here, I think. Although somehow it has to not make a mark other than removing the hair. So there's a very delicate balance there. But somehow it's the damage is permanent. Okay, so in which case that would not be our case. While we are having that thought, we are going to say, wait a minute, suppose that you did smear somebody's head with a depilatory, making their hair fall out. How would you end up paying 5 payments for that? We need to figure out how you could end up having somebody have nezek, tsar, ripui, and boshet, and shevet, all from having their head shaved. So we're going to go off on a tangent here. So this person, tsar, he would have tsar, di'itle kartufne bereshe v'tzavche mehahu kartufne. So if the guy has cracks in his skin, on his head, then it will hurt when you put the caustic chemical on. So you caused him pain. Okay, that's fine. That's the tsar. Ripui, debay asuyik, and he's going to need some medical care for the damage that you've just done to these open wounds on his head with your depilatory. So there we've got the ripui as well. Shevet, how is it going to cause him to lose work that you remove the hair on his head? To have a markid bekube, because he's a dancer in a wine store. I assume this is, not just a store that sells wine, but probably one where wine is being consumed there as well. So this is a bar, a saloon, a restaurant, something of that sort. And this guy his profession is that he's an entertainer in this place where people are drinking, and he dances. And he needs to be able to gesture with his head. And he can't throw his head around in his dance moves because of his pain in the cracks in his skin. Now, you might have said he can't dance because it's not attractive to watch people with no hair dance. And that might work with the shaving case, but it's not going to work with the depilatory case because shevet has to be for something that's temporary. So the hair itself can't be the problem here. It has to be something which will go away. So we're going to say that the pain of having the irritation to the cracks in his skin from the caustic chemical you put on his head is making it impractical for him to throw his head around in his dance moves. Okay, boshet and boshet gadol mizeh. Right, so apparently there is nothing more embarrassing or more emotionally painful in the world than having your children smear hair-destroying chemicals on your head. think this is an exaggeration. I can actually think of a lot of things that are more embarrassing than that. But they're right. It's certainly humiliating. There's a case in Shmuel Bet when a king is trying to send an insulting message to King David, and he sends David's ambassadors home with half of their heads and half of their beards shaved off as an insult. And I can't remember which commentary it is there, but somebody says, well, the guys then stop in Jericho and they wait there until their hair grows back before they go to the king and give him the message, because you can't actually walk into the palace with half a haircut. Apparently that's not a thing. And so one of the commentators says, well, why don't they just shave the other half? Because then at least they look symmetrical. And so he concludes from this that in fact, actually having your whole head shaved is actually more humiliating than having only half of your head shaved, because otherwise it would make sense for them to just finish the haircut. So I think we might be working on a theory like that, where having your hair shaved off is actually something very deeply humiliating. Certainly there are no shortage of situations in real human history when people have shaved other people's heads as a deliberate way of humiliating them. In any case, okay, so that's why he's going to have to pay him Boshet. And that all 5? Well, and Nezek, the permanent damage, presumably is easy because he's never going to have hair again on his head. So that's, and maybe it's cosmetic, but it's still a change in his body, which you can pay for as Nezek. Okay, so we never really did resolve Rabba's question, because we don't, there's a decent chance that this case with the assault on the parent is the same case, in which case the answer would be yes, you do pay all 5 payments in that case, or maybe not. So Rabba's question is still standing there open. And umilta de baya le Rabba pshita leila abaye lahachkisa v'lerava lahachkisa. And the thing that was questionable to Rabba was obvious to his 2 students, Abaye and Rava, but in opposite directions. And this is actually a very important thing to know about things that are obvious. That it's what is obvious to one person is not necessarily obvious to somebody else. Back when I used to actually teach in a classroom, Roni can, report that I did do that, although it was not necessarily something I was very good at. But back then, I used to try to make people explain in their essays the things that they thought were obvious, because that's where all the interesting stuff is. If you can articulate what you think is obvious and why it's obvious, you've already said all the most of the interesting stuff. And the reason for that is because obvious is very relative. In this case, Abaye thinks, well, let's see. The Itmar, he kawa yadovid samtav sofa lachzor. So we have this case, the same case that Rabba was asking about. He hit him on his arm and the arm got weakened, but it's going to heal. Abaye Amar notain lo shevet gedola v'shevet ktana. Abaye says we give him the big shevet and the small shevet. And I'd like to point out that both Abaye and Rabba seem to be using their vocabulary somewhat differently than we had previously in the chapter. And the word shevet is being used to mean what we were calling nezek. Rabba just asked, is there shevet in this case? And seeming to mean, is there nezek? And Abaye is talking about 2 different things, big shevet and small shevet, which seem to mean nezek and shevet. So it would seem that there was some evolution in the vocabulary over time. And the editor chose not to make it consistent across the chapter, which is interesting. In any case, Abaye says, yeah, you do pay him both nezek and shevet in that case. Rava Amar, but Rava says, Rava says, nope, you give him his daily wages that he missed out on the days that he actually missed work. And that's it. He doesn't, because there's no permanent loss of value to his body, there's no payment for permanent loss of value. There's no nezek. So it's obvious to Rava that the answer is no, and it's obvious to Abaye that the answer is yes. And their teacher is standing there saying, actually, I can't decide. So So as I said, obvious is in the eye of the beholder. Okay, that is what I have for the evening. Are there questions?
Can you explain why it's obvious to, I forget who, Abaye, I think it was, that he does get Nezek?
Abaye doesn't say, but back when he was articulating the question, Rabba suggested that if we would say that, the reason we would say it would be that we're indexing Nezek to the slave market, and the slave market value of this person does go down temporarily. And so if we pay it, it'll be because his value went down, and if we don't pay it, it'll be because it's going to go back up.
Thank you.
Sure. Anybody else?
I just have a comment
Mhm.
that, some of these issues are still dealt with today, obviously. I guess in her first job, Naomi was helping people when they applied for disability. And so they had to argue that they couldn't work. And the test always was, the judge would ask, well, could you be a toll collector? That was considered, yeah.
That's our version of a
And
cucumber
of the
watchman,
cucumber
I guess.
watchman, yes. But now there aren't, now most of the tolls are automatic, so those guys are out of luck.
So the disability payments are calculated not from the job, not because you can't do the job you're trained for, but because you can't do any job.
Yes, at least this is the way it was, at the time, at that time, which was sufficiently long ago that I would be in trouble if I said how long ago.
Okay, that's very interesting. Thank you.
Yeah.
I'm sure there's something we employ people doing at where you sit still and wait for something to happen.
And I guess the only equivalent of the slave market today is that you see how the value of baseball players is affected by whether they've had recent injuries.
Right. So slavery is now illegal for everybody except for professional athletes in this country. Slavery is still to a very significant extent legal for professional athletes, which distresses me a lot. And when I hear people having conversations about professional sports as if trading human beings or buying and selling human beings was a legitimate thing to do, it makes me very sad. But I think we've mostly replaced those payments with an actuary calculating the value to society or to their family or to themselves or whatever of their being able to do something over a period of time, which on the one hand is certainly better than having slavery, and on the other hand it still produces numbers that are usually not payable by the person who assaulted you. So we still haven't addressed the only really important question, which is, what are you supposed to do when the person who assaulted you is poor? And that one, I'm afraid, is kind of eternal and doesn't seem to be going anywhere. Although state disability payments do something, I guess. Anybody else? Okay. Then I will see you next week. I think I'm assuming that we're meeting next week, and then that the following week people are mostly off doing something fun. But we can talk about that next Monday. In the meantime, we will have class a week from tonight.
Are you saying this isn't fun?
I find it fun, but sometimes other people prefer to, go sit on a beach somewhere where it's warm, or whatever it is people do who actually, leave their house occasionally. In any case, I will see you guys all next Monday. Thank you very much. Good night.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.